our family was a lot younger, and my kids, Naomi and Jack, are with me today, and when they were wee, we moved from Texas over to Scotland, and we got this flat. And you know that way when you move into a flat or a new place, that you're excited to be there, but it's not familiar to you yet, so you're still a little bit unsure, and you're in that thing of settling in. So just feeling a little bit unsettled in this house. And it was January when we moved, and one night that we all went to sleep, and it's that pitch black middle of January, and I woke up in the middle of the night, and in my kind of half awake, half asleep, not kind of bleary-eyed, not quite fully compos mentis yet, I kind of glanced over towards the bedroom door, and I saw two glinting eyes, static, and I began to really freak out because there was no movement. It was just two little kind of glints just staring there. And I remembered all the stories of Smith Wigglesworth, how we would wake up in the middle of the night and see Satan at the foot of his bed and say things like, "Oh, it's just you," and roll over, you know. But I didn't do that. I was really panicking, and I was starting to pray, and it must have been about a couple of minutes that there's just these glints just there. And so I'm praying in the name of Jesus and all this, and then the worst thing that could possibly happen, they started to move. And they started to come closer to the bed. At this point, the adrenaline is kind of rushing through my body, and as the two glints came closer, I realized that it was just my beautiful, sweet daughter, Naomi, who'd gotten up in the middle of the night, but I was really convinced that it was a demon. And we've had our ding-dongs over the years, Naomi, but I would never call you a demon. I was really freaked out, and it wasn't until she got closer to me that I realized that it was not the presence of evil, but the presence of my daughter, whom I loved. My eyesight had to adjust so I could see her for who she was. And today I want to speak to you about this idea of proximity or closeness and seeing. In John chapter 9, we've got a narrative where there's a link between how people see Jesus and the direction that they're traveling. How they see Jesus and the direction they're traveling. And John challenges his readers. He asks us to consider the movements that we're making in our lives, the directions that we are traveling towards Jesus or away from him, to seeing Jesus or to being blinded to who Jesus is. Those who move towards him are engulfed in his light. They see him as he is, the one who is the very incarnate image of God. But those who move away from him become shrouded in darkness. Their understanding of God is diminished until the very vision of God has no real correlation to who God really is. And John, I know you guys have been working through John quite a lot over the last wee while, and you'll have noticed probably that John is obsessed with the idea of light and sight. For John, Jesus is the light who reveals the very nature and character of God. He's the one who enables us to see God and ourselves rightly and to enter into a relationship with God that's marked by grace and truth and believing obedience. And in the opening of his book, John just gets straight to it. He says of Jesus, "In him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overtake it." And Jesus himself even speaks of himself as a light which reveals not only the heart of God for us, but also the hearts of men towards God. It says this in John 3, "This is the judgment," Jesus says, "that the light has come into the world, and people love darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. For all who do evil hate the light and do not come to the light so that their deeds may not be exposed. But those who do what is true come to the light, that it may be clearly seen that their deeds have been done in God." So Jesus has not come to pronounce condemnation on people, but as he shines the light of God's goodness into the world, people will judge themselves by their response to him. There are people who are moving away from his light lest they be exposed. But there are those who move towards his light, and as they do, they're moving towards truth. And again, Jesus says of himself in John 8, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And so there's this idea again of this moving. What direction are you moving in your proximity to Jesus and how you see him? Those moving towards Jesus are moving from darkness to light, and in his light, they find life. And in John 9, John's going to illustrate this with a story of healing that provokes two different responses, two movements, one towards Jesus and one away from him. And the result is both a discovery and a loss of identity that accompanies each direction, each movement. And the narrative begins with a question from Jesus' disciples. It's odd. Jesus' disciples haven't been in the narrative of John since chapter 6, and then they pop up here at the beginning of chapter 9, and then they kind of fade away again. But they ask this question as they're passing by a man who was born blind. And they're trying to attempt to engage Jesus in kind of a bit of theological debate, I think, which is pretty bold. They ask this question, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, at the time, blind people were often classed as destitute because they didn't have the medical advances that we have now, and so people who were blind really couldn't work, couldn't navigate around very well, and generally had to resort to begging. But people who were blind were not automatically considered to be sinners. But it was common for people to think that children were punished for the sins of their parents. Or there was even a notion at the time that children could sin in utero, meaning they could sin in the womb. And so that's where this question from the disciples is coming from. Now, if they really wanted a theological debate about the nature of suffering, they could have just asked Jesus, why was this man born blind? It's a pretty good question. But the question that they asked is laced with judgment, and it's much more narrow than that. The question they asked is, who sinned to cause this man's blindness? They've already made a judgment, a presumption, that they are in the position to determine this man's condition, and that's a result of somebody's sin. And unfortunately, perhaps a little ironically, Jesus' response to their question is partially obscured by many of the translations that we have so that we don't see it clearly. And I hope you don't mind. I want to take a wee look at the Greek. Is that all right? Whenever somebody gets up and they're doing a sermon and they say, we're going to look at the Hebrew or the Greek, be nervous. You should be. And go and check it out later on. But I'll try not to get too intense about this, okay? But I think it's important that we look at it. So here's how Jesus' response is often rendered in some of our translations. So I've just put the NRSV and the NIV up here. So you see in the NRSV, Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. In the NIV, Jesus said, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Now, does anybody see a problem with what Jesus says there? Or does anything about that kind of feel a bit strange? These translations seem to imply that God subjected this man to a life of blindness so that one day Jesus would have the opportunity to come along and heal him and God would be glorified. And if that's the case, you have God the Father creating blindness and God the Son casting it out or healing it. And as Jesus said in Matthew, when he was accused of casting out demons by the power of Satan, a house divided against itself cannot stand. So I personally can have a problem with the idea that God made somebody blind and subjected them to this whole life so that one day he could get a bit of kudos when Jesus came along to heal him. So what do we do about this? Well, the problem actually revolves around a small Greek participle. It's hina. Say hina with me. You're Greek speakers. There we go. And hina is the word that's translated here as so that. See that? The so that, hina. And hina is, it denotes a purpose or a result. So, for instance, I might say, I went to Marks and Spencer's so that I could buy a shirt. You see that? So the so that is it's telling you the purpose or the result of what I've done. But for grammatical reasons that are way too boring to go into here, but are present in this verse, hina can also be translated as what's called an imperative, like an exhortation or a proclamation. So we get another place in Mark where hina is actually translated as an imperative. When Jesus is speaking to another blind man, and Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." It's the same word. So in 60% of the New Testament, it's translated as so that. The other 40% is translated as this kind of let, this kind of imperative language. And there are many scholars who think that that is how hina should be translated in Jesus' answers to his disciples in John 9. And if we do that, you'll see that it changes the flavor of it quite a bit. Neither this man nor his parents has sinned, but let the works of God be revealed in him. His blindness is not a punishment from God for sin, nor was his blindness given to him by God to allow Jesus to prove a point. God's only disposition towards this man is that his goodness will be revealed in and through him. And so Jesus warns his disciples that their question is full of wrong-headed judgmentalism. And as his followers, they're not called to pronounce judgment over people, but to join in his mission of displaying the availability of God's light and life through works of the kingdom. And he tells them in verse 4, we, interestingly, he doesn't say I, he says, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work, but as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And here's this idea of Jesus again shining so that people can see and be drawn to God. And this is also a warning from John to his readers. And if you're reading this right now, that includes you and me. We are not called to be beacons of judgment in the world, but to join Jesus in doing the works of the kingdom so that people can see truly who he is. I don't know if we want to do it like Jesus does here, though, because he makes a mud paste and he puts it on the man's eyes and sends him to wash in this pool called Siloam. And John tells us that Siloam means sent. In John's gospel, Jesus is continually describing himself as the one who is sent by God into the world so that people can see. And now the blind man is sent to a pool called Sent so that he might see. And then, as a result of that, the man becomes one who is sent to testify to the goodness of Jesus so that others might see. And from this point on, the man born blind who is healed is going to start identifying more and more with Jesus. He's going to start this immediately with his neighbors, because when he comes home after he's been healed, they start a debate about if it's really him. His neighbors. I mean, I don't know how friendly you are with my neighbors, but I would hope my neighbors would, recognize me. There wouldn't be a debate in my street. Is that Kenny? They would actually know what I look like. But they're having this debate about if it's really him. And they've known him all their lives, but now they can't trust their eyes because of the transformation that's happened in him. And I know you guys worked through all of the I am statements of Jesus in John's gospel last year. And here, the blind man's identification with Jesus begins with his own I am statement. I'm he. It's me. I'm the one. I'm your neighbor. I'm the one you're talking about. And when they ask him how he can see, he says this: the man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. Then I went and washed and received my sight. And I want you to notice here that he calls Jesus the man. Not like stick it to the man, but the man. Jesus, the man called Jesus. And we're going to track how the healed man refers to Jesus as the story continues. He begins by calling him the man. But he's already beginning to testify to the goodness of God in Jesus. And when they ask him where Jesus is, he responds, I don't know. And so another thing is revealed here. There's a humility about this guy. He testifies that he has been healed by a man named Jesus, But he makes no further claims concerning who Jesus is. In humility, he simply says he doesn't know. And I want you to know that it's okay if you don't know. Often we feel like we can't share Jesus with others because we don't know enough. I need more theology. You do need more theology, I have to say that. But we have this sense, I need more theology, or I need to be trained, or I need to have all these answers in case people ask me questions. And actually, it's our personal testimony to what God has done in us that is the most powerful witness we can have. It assumes a posture of humility. In our courses, our students are sometimes concerned that they can never get really above an 80 on an essay. It's very hard to get an 80 above a theological essay. Some are really upset that they can't get 100. But the answer to that is that if you get 100 on a theological essay, you have figured God out. Or you are God. So we need to maintain a posture of humility. And this is not the posture exhibited by the Pharisees. They say, this man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath, talking about Jesus. Others said, how can a man who's a sinner perform such signs? And they're divided. And while here there's at least a possibility in their thinking that Jesus might not be the enemy that they've considered him to be, the two movements that I spoke about earlier are beginning to be on the display. You've got the healed man who's moving towards Jesus, and you've got these Pharisees who are debating about who Jesus is, and they're beginning to move away from him. Both movements are dependent on who they perceive Jesus to be. And when the Pharisees ask the man who's been healed who he reckons Jesus is, he says this: he's a prophet. See the progression. So Jesus was a man. Now the healed man says, well, haven't thought about it again. I think he might be a prophet, one who speaks and acts on behalf of God. But the Pharisees cannot stomach the thought of that. So in response, it's a great tactic. They just say, well, we don't even believe you were blind to begin with. Right? So they call in the blind man's or the healed man's parents for questioning. But there's this threat in the air that anybody who confesses Jesus as the Messiah is going to be ostracized from the synagogue. And so the healed man's parents are scared to speak up. And in the heat of the moment, they actually abandon their responsibility for their son. And they say, don't talk to us. Ask him. And the actions of the religious leaders here contain a warning for all of us called to the responsibility of shepherding communities. The exertion of power, the maintenance of power, threats over people, the insistence on our own authority are often the very things that create an oppressive atmosphere that shuts down the experience of the breath of God's Spirit moving in a community and pulls down the blinds that allows God's light to shine in. And even now in our Western evangelical world, there are many cases where abuse in churches is being met by leaders who are closing ranks and who are gaslighting victims, and they are robbing those people of the joy of knowing God in their community. The light of Jesus gets smothered under the darkness and the arrogance of oppressive leadership. And so, frustrated in their attempts, the Pharisees call the man back in for further questioning, and they ask him again they're going to ask him who this Jesus is. But they start with this. They say, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. Talk about poisoning the well. You ever see it like your favorite crime drama where there's kind of some corrupt cops and they pull the guy in and they slam him down on the table and they say, you're going to tell us this? And they're kind of forcing this interrogation, trying to get a statement out of the witness that they want to hear. And that's the same here. This give glory to God is an oath formula. It's kind of like their version of do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? And then on top of that, they say, look, we already know this man's a sinner. Just kind of give us a confession that we want. The direction they're traveling in, the direction of their movement is becoming obvious. At the beginning, they were debating, well, maybe is Jesus a sinner? Maybe he's not. Look at this deed that he's done. And then they've moved to, nah, it's not a miracle at all. And now they're declaring that they know with certainty that Jesus is a sinner. And the man's response is the opposite to theirs. Again, I don't know. I don't know whether he's a sinner, but one thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. And here again, the man's humility is on display, and he's refusing to enter into their game of judgment. He's speaking clearly and testifying to what he has experienced. He's a witness, a sent one, who's proclaiming the works of God. And when they ask him what Jesus did for him, he reveals to them that he's actually moved further down the road towards Jesus. He says, I've told you already, and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again, by the way? Are you thinking about becoming one of Jesus' disciples as well? And we were talking earlier about this at the prayer time. You could take this as like a typical Glaswegian sarky comment that the guy is making. I actually think he's saying it naively. It's hilarious. I think he's like, oh, you're asking the same questions, some of the same questions I am. Are you wanting to join me in becoming his disciple? But the point is, the man has moved from Jesus was a man to a prophet to the one that I want to follow, the one that I want to apprentice myself to. And the Pharisees respond by saying they're disciples of Moses. They don't even know where Jesus come from. And here's the bit that I think the man really gets stuck into them, because he starts to use their own thinking against them and to expose their hypocrisy. He says, this is an astonishing thing. You don't know where he comes from, but he opened my eyes. We know, now he's including himself with the Pharisees, so he's using their thinking. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. If this man were not from God, then he could do nothing. And his logic is clear. Only God heals, and because Jesus performed this healing, he must be from God. But the Pharisees have become the kind of wrong-headed, blinded, and judgmental people that Jesus warned his disciples against becoming in the beginning. And here's what they say to him. You were born entirely in sin. See the connection to their judgment to the question that the disciples asked at the beginning? And you are trying to teach us? Who do you think you are? And they drove him out. And they now sit in judgment over Jesus, over his works, and over the man who's a witness to the work of God. And in order to fully close their eyes to the work of God, they must label the man a sinner and cast him out of the community, because his very presence might lead them to repent of their pride and their hubris. And so you can see the clear movements here between the man and the leaders. Since his healing, the light of the knowledge of who Jesus is has slowly been permeating the man's mind, his heart, his words, and his will. And in response, he's moved in the direction of Jesus. But the leaders have clearly moved away from the light Jesus has shone in and through the man, preferring instead the darkness of their own pride and wisdom. And in his rejection by the religious community, the healed man's identification with Jesus is complete. And so John concludes a narrative with a confession and a judgment. Jesus heard that they had driven the man out. The man's actually suffered a series of rejections. He's been rejected by his neighbors, in some senses by his parents, and by his religious community. But in John 6:37, Jesus says, anyone who comes to me, I will never drive away. And now Jesus comes to the man who's been driven out because of him. And when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? The man answered, who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him. Jesus uses the term Son of Man throughout John to refer to his role of making God known in the human story. And there's another thing here that makes this scene really interesting. And if you've been paying attention, you'll have noticed one glaring thing at the heart of this narrative so far, a really obvious thing to do with Jesus and this man. Anybody got an idea? Oh, good, you've not been paying attention. Okay. Never seen him. Up until this point, the man who is given his sight by Jesus has never actually seen Jesus. So while I don't want to diminish the physical healing that happens, because I believe in that and I've seen it happen, and I think Jesus, when he heals whole people. But this is not just about a guy being restored to physical sight. In fact, even more importantly, it's about a guy who, because of his experience of God's goodness in Jesus, has had his heart, his spiritual sight open to who Jesus is long before he sees him. And this is a deep truth at the heart of the narrative. The one who has not seen Jesus is the one who has truly seen him. And now he gets to see him face to face. Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he. I am he." And the man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. The man's already been on a journey of perceiving Jesus' true nature as the one sent from God, and he was already witnessing to Jesus' light and life. And now, face to face, he confesses his faith in him and bows to worship him. For the healed man, Jesus was first a man, then a prophet, then one sent from God, then the one he wants to apprentice himself to, and finally, Lord and God. To finish it off, Jesus speaks to the Pharisees. Well, he doesn't actually speak to them. He just he's over in the corner and he says this out loud so that the Pharisees who are over there will hear what he's saying. He says, "I came into this world for judgment so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind." And some of the Pharisees who were with him heard this and said to him, "Surely we are not blind, are we?" Suddenly their confidence is diminished. Or maybe that the question is still just full of arrogance. You can't be implying that we don't see. Maybe they still believe that they are the ones who are rightly perceiving the situation, and more importantly, that they are rightly perceiving Jesus. And Jesus says to them, "If you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say, 'We see,' your sin remains." And sin in John's gospel is really centered on the idea of unbelief in Jesus. And because the religious leaders have moved towards unbelief in their arrogant assertion that Jesus is a Sabbath breaker, a sinner, and is one opposed to God, they can no longer hide behind any claim to ignorance or spiritual blindness. By proclaiming that they are the ones who know, that they are the ones who truly see, they declare their unbelief in Jesus and they confirm their sin. It is them and not Jesus who's opposed to God. Okay, what can we take away from this? I think, the question really is about what direction you and I are traveling in. And I think that might be what John and what Jesus wants each of us to ask ourselves today. Are you seeing Jesus more clearly? The man born blind is moving along a continuum in relation to Jesus, where his initial sight leads to a kind of deeper experience of life as his understanding and his commitment to Jesus grows. And we should be aware that this journey towards Jesus is not without its difficulties. He loses relationships along the way and is rejected by his community. But his experience of Jesus, this physical and spiritual healing that's been provided for him, are the fuel to continue his pursuit of discipleship. And John is telling us that, yes, the journey of following Jesus will involve healing and restoration, but also difficulty and hardship. And ultimately, the question underneath it all is then, what's going to fuel your journey? Is Jesus, do you believe that Jesus is who he claims to be? And to make this journey, you need to have a certain sense of humility. That's the momentum. The man says only what he knows at each stage, and he's never afraid to say that he doesn't know. And this is humility, to say, this is what I've experienced and discovered of God, and this is how I've grown to know him, but there are things that I don't know. That's the posture of one who is seeing God rightly, as the eternal, glorious God who can never be truly fathomed. To have your eyes truly open to God is to acknowledge that there's more of him still to discover. This doesn't mean that we can't speak of what we know or that we can't hold core convictions of what's true of him, because this guy acts as a witness to the truth of who Jesus is at every stage of his journey, despite his lack of experience. It just means that we need to remain humble before a God who is, in his Son Jesus, always ready to shine more of the light of his understanding on us. The journey towards Jesus is one of humility and of openness and of seeking and of allowing his light to shine on you. Maybe the other question is your vision of Jesus dimming? Because conversely, the Pharisees' issue is one of judgment and immovability. They can't see Jesus for who he is, ironically, because of their static ideas of what God does or doesn't do. And so their vision of God is like calcified. It's become stone-like in their doctrine and their religious practice. And all of their actions, they're trying to protect their pattern of life from the dynamic work of God in Jesus that's happening right in front of their eyes. And so as a result, they claim to know God, but they're unable to recognize him. And those of us who've been around the block a few times can maybe be a bit prone to this. There's a cynicism sometimes that develops and a judgment about the experience of others. We always want to proclaim where we think people are in their spiritual walks. Or who's in or who's out. There's an I know all sense to this. No one can teach me, just like the Pharisees reject the guy at the end of his testimony to them. And it actually doesn't matter if you see yourself as more conservative or more liberal. The threat of pride remains. And fortunately, John's gospel shows us that Jesus is persistent in confronting such people so that they might see him for who he truly is and change. And so perhaps this morning, there's a bit of that confrontation that's happening in your heart. God knows I need it. Finally, I want to speak to people who are here who might feel like your experience with Jesus is just beginning. You're just figuring this Christianity and church stuff out, slowly. But you know one thing, you feel drawn to the person of Jesus. There's lots you don't know, but he feels like a lighthouse in the waters of your life. And wherever you are on the journey, I want to encourage you to keep moving in that direction. Just like the man who was healed, Jesus wants to shine his light in his life into yours. Often that will be through people like the folks in this church who have experienced that same life that Jesus brings. And at other times it feels like it's coming directly from God himself. Sometimes it will come in the middle of difficult things, of devastating things. In those moments, Jesus will make himself known to you. And your journey, as you're making it, will become a witness that brings life to others. As you discover Jesus, your experience will speak to those of us who've been following Jesus for a long time and need to be taught again or reminded once again of his goodness. Ultimately, you'll discover a God in the face of Jesus who's worth trusting in, who's worth giving your life to, who's worth your confession of faith, and is worth your worship. This is the Jesus who is the light of the world, who will never drive you out, but will look for you, accept you, and help you to see. Let's pray. Jesus, you know what each one of us needs this morning, and we thank you that in your coming into this world, and in your living, and your acting, in your death and resurrection, and in your ascension, and in your presence here with us now, you have made yourself known to us. And so we come before you humbly today, God. We thank you for the ways that we have experienced your goodness and that you have drawn us towards you. And would you keep us from an arrogance or humility that thinks that we have learned it all, or that we know everything about you, or that we see perfectly. Instead, would you keep us in a place of humility where we're constantly learning to see you once again afresh and new. And would you help us to be companions to each other on the journey of grace and of truth, to be encouragers and not those who are judgmental. That we as your people would see you and worship you. Amen.